In November 1910, 7 influential men boarded a private train departing from Hoboken, New Jersey, bound for Jekyll Island, Georgia. These men collectively represented nearly 1/4 of the world's total wealth. Over the span of 10 days, operating under absolute secrecy, they drafted the framework for what would become the Federal Reserve, America's central bank, privately controlled by the very financial institutions it was supposed to oversee. This was not a government initiative. This was, in the literal sense, a covert conspiracy, 7 private bankers meeting behind closed doors, using aliases, designing a law that would quietly hand them authority over America's entire money supply. And their plan succeeded. On December 23, 1913, with most members of Congress already gone home for the Christmas recess, the Federal Reserve Act slipped through both chambers. Just 3 years after the secret gathering on Jekyll Island, these men had achieved something no emperor or conqueror had ever accomplished. They privatized the creation of money itself. And here's what should concern you. The Federal Reserve is neither federal nor does it possess reserves in the traditional sense. It's a private banking collective operating under a government-styled name. For more than a century since the Jekyll Island meeting, Congress has never conducted a complete audit of the Fed. Not one time. This is the story of how 7 men captured America's monetary system, why the banks that built the Fed continue to dominate it, and why every dollar you carry is technically a debt instrument owned by private bankers. Understanding Jekyll Island isn't merely historical, it explains who truly influences your money, your savings, and your economic future. So let me walk you through exactly what happened in November 1910, who these 7 men really were, how they orchestrated this plan, and why you still live under the system they quietly designed 115 years ago. On the night of November 22, 1910, 7 men slipped onto a private rail car at Hoboken Station. They were told to travel alone, no aides, no secretaries. They were told to arrive separately so as not to raise suspicion. And most importantly, they were instructed to use only first names. No last names, no full introductions. Absolute secrecy. This wasn't paranoia. It was essential. If the public learned that the nation's most powerful bankers were assembling in private to craft financial legislation, outrage would follow. Americans distrusted Wall Street. They despised J.P. Morgan. Any bill authored by bankers would have been doomed. So the men disguised the trip as a simple duck hunting excursion. Their train traveled 1,000 miles south to a coastal retreat, Jekyll Island, Georgia. The island belonged to the exclusive Jekyll Island Club, a private haven whose members included Morgans, Rockefellers, Vanderbilts, and Goulds. It was the ideal setting: remote, private, controlled. The 7 men on that island represented approximately $600 billion in $1,910, roughly $20 trillion today. In other words, they controlled nearly 1/4 of the world's total wealth. Here are the conspirators: Nelson Aldrich, political strategist and chairman of the National Monetary Commission, extremely wealthy, deeply tied to the Rockefellers, and the man responsible for shepherding the bankers' plan through Congress.
Frank Vanderlip, president of National Citibank, now Citibank, representing Rockefeller interests. Vanderlip later admitted the truth about the meeting. Discovery would have been fatal to our plan. Paul Warburg, partner at Kuhn, Loeb & Co., and the intellectual architect of the Federal Reserve. Warburg brought deep knowledge of European central banking systems and shaped much of the plan structure. Benjamin Strong, J.P. Morgan's representative and future head of the New York Federal Reserve Bank, the most powerful position in the system. Henry Davison, senior partner at J.P. Morgan & Co., responsible for coordination and ensuring unity among the bankers. Charles Norton, president of First National Bank of New York, representing another Rockefeller-linked financial dynasty. A.P. Andrews, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury present not to represent the public, but to give the meeting a thin veneer of official legitimacy. For 10 days, the group worked in isolation at the Jekyll Island Club. No servants were allowed near sensitive discussions. The men developed a central banking plan that would appear to serve the public but would, in reality, be controlled by private banking interests.
Before Jekyll Island, you need to understand the Panic of 1907 because major changes to financial systems almost always arise during times of crisis. And the Panic of 1907 was precisely the crisis these bankers needed. In October 1907, the stock market crashed. Banks collapsed across the country. Fear spread and depositors raced to withdraw their savings. Bank runs erupted from New York all the way to San Francisco. The entire financial structure was unraveling. At that time, the United States had no central bank. The country had experimented with two earlier ones, the first Bank of the United States 1791 to 1811 and the second Bank 1816 to 1836, which Andrew Jackson famously dismantled. Jackson warned, the bold effort the present bank had made to control the government is but a premonition of the fate that awaits the American people if they allow this institution to continue. Jackson won that battle, and the U.S. went without a central bank for 77 years. But without a central bank, when the crisis struck in 1907, there was no lender of last resort, no entity capable of injecting liquidity into the system. Everything was teetering. Enter J.P. Morgan. John Pierpont Morgan, the most dominant banker in America, controlled enormous railroad empires, steel corporations, and financial institutions. When the panic erupted, Morgan personally assembled the rescue effort. He locked the country's top bankers inside his library, forced them to pool resources, and halted the bank runs by sheer willpower and an ocean of capital. Morgan saved the system. But his motives weren't purely patriotic. Morgan's rescue demonstrated a point. America needed a central bank and, in his view, private bankers should be the ones directing it. The Panic of 1907 bankrupted 25 banks and trust companies. Businesses collapsed. Thousands lost their jobs. The stock market plunged 50%. Yet Morgan emerged stronger than ever. He'd shown that private banking power could steer the U.S. economy better than the government, or at least that was the narrative his circle promoted. In 1908, Congress passed the Aldrich-Vreeland Act establishing a National Monetary Commission to study how to prevent future panics. The man appointed to lead it was Senator Nelson Aldrich, a powerful Republican from Rhode Island. Aldrich was not just politically influential. He was financially connected, deeply tied to J.P. Morgan, and also the father-in-law of John D. Rockefeller Jr. The commission was supposed to analyze European banking systems. In reality, it provided political cover while bankers drafted their own reform blueprint. And they would do that at a secluded island retreat where no one would see what they were constructing. Their primary challenges. Problem number 1. Americans despised central banks. Solution: do not call it a central bank. Call it the Federal Reserve System, a name that sounded governmental and reassuring. Problem number 2. Americans distrusted Wall Street. Solution: create regional Federal Reserve banks to give the illusion of decentralization while ensuring the New York Fed remained dominant. Problem number 3. True government control would limit banker power. Solution: make the system privately owned by banks but backed by government authority. Private banks would run it, the government would merely appear involved. This was the brilliance of the Jekyll Island design. A central bank that looked public, acted private, and wielded the power to create money out of nothing. Here's the mechanism they built. The government needs money. Instead of raising taxes, it issues bonds (IOUs). The Federal Reserve buys the bonds by creating money digitally or printing currency from nothing. The government spends the newly created money. Taxpayers later pay interest on those bonds. Member banks, private owners of the Fed, receive guaranteed dividends. In short, new money is created from nothing, the public pays interest, and the banks profit. This is the core of the system the 7 men engineered. The Jekyll Island draft was finished by late November 1910. The next step was political maneuvering. Senator Aldrich introduced it as the Aldrich Plan in 1912, but it failed. Everyone knew Aldrich's Wall Street connections, so they rebranded. With Woodrow Wilson's election in 1912, the bankers saw an opportunity. Although Wilson campaigned against banking monopolies, his financially strained campaign quietly benefited from the influence of those very same interests. His closest advisor, Colonel Edward House, was deeply connected to the financiers behind the plan. With Democrats controlling Congress, the bill was reintroduced as the Federal Reserve Act, a supposed reform meant to restrain big banks, not empower them. But the timing was key. Congress prepared to adjourn for Christmas on December 19, 1913. Many lawmakers had already left Washington. At the last moment, a vote was scheduled. On December 23, 2 days before Christmas, with many absent, the Federal Reserve Act passed. The House approved it to 198 to 60. The Senate passed it 43 to 25. Wilson signed it the same day. It became law when almost no one was watching. Congressman Charles Lindbergh Sr. warned, "This act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth. The worst legislative crime of the ages is perpetrated by this banking bill." But the deed was done. The Federal Reserve opened on November 16, 1914. Paul Warburg joined the Federal Reserve Board. Benjamin Strong, the Morgan representative, became the first governor of the New York Fed.
Since then, your money has steadily lost value, government debt has exploded, banks have been repeatedly rescued, wealth inequality has soared, and every dollar you own is a Federal Reserve note created by a system designed in secrecy over a century ago. Frank Vanderlip later admitted, "If it had been exposed that our group wrote the banking bill, it would have had no chance of passage." He was right, but the secrecy worked. The bill passed. The system was established. Now you know the truth. 7 Men, 10 Days. Jekyll Island, November 1910. That's when America's money was privatized. That's when control shifted to the banks. And that is why, 115 years later, you still live under the system they quietly built. If you want to understand how money actually functions, why inflation drains your wealth, and who gains during every financial crisis, keep learning. Because Jekyll Island wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the financial system that still shapes your life. The creature from Jekyll Island is real, and it's still feeding. The system they secretly built was now official. What followed proves why they wanted such power. World War I. Just months after the Fed opened, WWI began. The Fed financed America's involvement by creating new money to buy government war bonds. The money supply doubled. Banks earned vast interest. J.P. Morgan became the purchasing agent for Britain and France, earning enormous commissions. The 1920s bubble, the Fed kept interest rates artificially low, fueling speculation. When the bubble burst in 1929, the Fed allowed the money supply to contract by 1/3, worsening the Great Depression. Small banks collapsed. Large banks absorbed them cheaply. Power concentrated. World War II. Again, the Fed created money to fund the war, ballooning government debt and enriching financial institutions through bond interest. 1971, the end of the gold standard. Nixon severed the last link between the dollar and gold. The dollar became pure fiat. Now there was no limit to how much money the Fed could create. 2008 financial crisis. Banks collapsed due to their own reckless behavior, but the Fed created $4.5 trillion to bail them out. Major banks survived. Executives kept bonuses. Meanwhile, millions of Americans lost homes and jobs. 2020 pandemic crisis. The Fed created over $4 trillion in months. Stocks soared. Billionaires gained trillions. Small businesses shuttered. Workers suffered. By 2021, inflation surged to 40-year highs, an inevitable result of massive money creation. Ordinary Americans paid the price through rising costs. The Fed raised interest rates, making mortgages and loans more expensive, hurting workers but increasing bank profits. Since 1913, the dollar has lost 98% of its purchasing power. What cost $1 in 1913 costs $30 today. Inflation is not an accident, it is an intentional policy target. Banks benefit. You pay. The Federal Reserve holds trillions in government debt. Member banks receive guaranteed dividends. The system always protects the financial elite. Who owns the Fed? Not the government. Private banks. The largest include J.P. Morgan Chase, Citibank, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, descendants of, or connected to, the original financial dynasties represented on Jekyll Island. The Fed is independent, meaning independent of Congress. but not independent of the banks that own it. Congress has never performed a full audit. Efforts by Ron Paul, Bernie Sanders, and others were repeatedly blocked. The Fed has operated with extraordinary secrecy, $29 trillion in covert loans during 2008, and disclosed foreign central bank arrangements closed-door policy meetings private ownership structure. The 7 men at Jekyll Island created a central bank disguised as a government agency but run like a private cartel with the power to create money at will. They hid their identities, wrote the bill in secret, and passed it right before Christmas when few were watching.